The first Ottoman cannon fired. The sound was like the sky splitting. A stone ball weighing hundreds of pounds smashed into Vienna's outer wall, shattering medieval stonework and sending fragments flying like shrapnel. The siege of Vienna had begun. For the next several weeks, Vienna would become a vision of apocalypse. The Ottoman artillery barrage was relentless. Dozens of massive cannons firing in rotation so the bombardment never stopped. Day and night, stone balls and iron shot hammered the walls. Each impact sent tremors through the ground. Dust clouds rose continuously, choking defenders and obscuring vision. Stone that had stood for centuries crumbled under modern artillery's brutal mathematics. But walls are just stone. The real defense was the men behind them. Every time a section of wall cracked, defenders packed the breach with earth, timber, anything they could find. When a gate splintered, they braced it with beams torn from their own homes. Women and elderly men who couldn't fight carried stones to the ramparts for ammunition. Children, some barely 10 years old, ran messages between defensive positions, darting through bombardment with a bravery born of not fully understanding their mortality. The entire city became a single organism devoted to survival. But the bombardment was just preparation for the real horror, the assault. Ottoman engineers were masters of siege warfare, having perfected techniques over centuries of conquest. They dug approach trenches, zigzagging lines that crept closer to the walls while providing cover from defensive fire. Janissaries worked in these trenches under constant harassment from Vienna's defenders, advancing foot by foot through mud and blood. And beneath the ground, an even more terrifying campaign unfolded: the Mine War. Ottoman sappers tunneled under Vienna's walls, digging through earth to place explosive charges that would blow breaches from below. The work was claustrophobic nightmare, men crawling through narrow tunnels by candlelight, never knowing if the ceiling would collapse and bury them alive. Their goal was to pack chambers with gunpowder barrels directly beneath Vienna's fortifications, then ignite them and create instant breaches. The defenders, however, had their own miners. Vienna's engineers dug countermines, listening for the sound of Ottoman digging, trying to intercept enemy tunnels before they could be armed. When defenders found an Ottoman mine, they would flood it or blow it prematurely. Several times, massive underground explosions shook the entire city, collapsing tunnels on both sides, entombing dozens of miners in instant graves of earth and timber. Can you imagine that terror? Fighting in absolute darkness underground, knowing that at any second the world might explode around you or collapse and suffocate you in earth? This was medieval warfare at its most nightmarish. Above ground, the Janissary assaults came in waves. These elite Ottoman soldiers were trained from childhood to know no fear, to value death in battle as the highest honor. They came forward in organized ranks despite murderous defensive fire, matchlock muskets barking from the walls, cannons loaded with grape shot tearing bloody lanes through their formations, crossbow bolts and arrows falling like steel rain. They came carrying scaling ladders, grappling hooks, anything to get onto Vienna's walls. And they died by the hundreds, but they kept coming. The Ottoman system was built on this: overwhelming force applied relentlessly until the enemy broke. For every Janissary killed, another stepped forward. They fought shouting, "Allahu Akbar, God is great," convinced that death in jihad guaranteed paradise. The defenders shot them down, hacked them apart on the walls, pushed ladders back so attackers fell screaming to their deaths. The carnage was beyond description. Bodies piling up beneath the walls, blood running in streams that mixed with autumn rain. The siege dragged on through October. Both sides were exhausted, pushed far beyond normal human endurance. Inside Vienna, food supplies dwindled to almost nothing. Defenders ate rats, boiled leather, anything with nutritional value. Disease spread: dysentery, typhus, infections from untreated wounds. The city began to smell like death, a stench so powerful it permeated everything, made food taste like corpses, made sleep impossible. Count von Salm himself was wounded by stone fragments from a cannon impact, but he refused to leave the walls. At 70 years old, bleeding from shrapnel wounds, he continued commanding the defense, his presence alone worth 1,000 soldiers. But conditions outside the walls were arguably worse. The Ottoman army was suffering catastrophically from the weather. Autumn rains intensified into torrential downpours that turned the siege camp into a swamp. Tents collapsed under water weight. Supply wagons sank axle-deep in mud. Trenches flooded, drowning soldiers who couldn't climb out in time. The cold deepened as October progressed. Soldiers who had marched from the Mediterranean now shivered in European autumn, wearing armor that conducted cold directly into their bodies. Disease ravaged the Ottoman camp even worse than Vienna. Tens of thousands fell ill. The same dysentery and typhus, but in open-air camps with inadequate sanitation. Horses starved because fodder couldn't be transported through the mud. The once magnificent army began to look like a mob of desperate, sick, freezing men. The proud war drums that had beaten so confidently in September now sounded hollow and exhausted. Suleiman watched his invincible army deteriorating. He had broken cities before, Rhodes, Belgrade, Budapest, but Vienna was different. The walls wouldn't yield. Every assault was repulsed. Every mine was countered. The defenders seemed to multiply rather than diminish. And now his own army was dying from causes he couldn't fight with cannons or cavalry. Word reached the Ottoman camp that a relief army was assembling in Germany, perhaps 30,000 men marching south to Vienna's rescue. They were still weeks away, but their approach changed the strategic calculation. If Suleiman was trapped between Vienna's walls and a relief force, his army could be destroyed. The Sultan faced a decision that would haunt him the rest of his life. He could order one final massive assault, throw everything at the walls in a desperate bid to take the city before the relief army arrived. It might work, or it might annihilate his Janissary Corps and leave the Ottoman Empire vulnerable. Or he could retreat, abandon the siege, march back to Istanbul, and accept that Vienna had defeated him. Neither option was acceptable, but one preserved his army for future campaigns. In mid-October, after nearly a month of siege, Suleiman ordered a final bombardment. 3 days of continuous artillery fire that shook the earth and made conversation impossible inside the city. Vienna's walls crumbled under impacts, creating breaches that desperate defenders struggled to plug. It seemed like the final preparation before an apocalyptic assault that would finally overwhelm the exhausted defenders. Then, on the morning of the fourth day, something changed. The cannons fell silent. Defenders on the walls, deafened by weeks of bombardment, thought at first something was wrong with their hearing. But the silence was real, and through the morning mist, they saw something that seemed impossible. The Ottoman camp was being dismantled, tents coming down, cannons being limbered to wagons, soldiers forming marching columns. Suleiman the Magnificent, the Sultan who had never retreated, never been denied, was withdrawing. The reaction inside Vienna was shock before it became celebration. Soldiers who had accepted death as inevitable suddenly had to process that they would live. Some laughed hysterically. Others wept. Many simply collapsed from exhaustion, their bodies finally acknowledging the toll of weeks without sleep, without food, without hope. Church bells, the few that hadn't been melted for ammunition, rang for the first time in a month. The sound was ragged and beautiful, announcing to the world that Vienna had survived. Count von Salm, wounded and exhausted, addressed his soldiers from the walls. "You have done what no other army in Europe could do. You have faced the greatest power on earth and stood firm. Europe will remember this day forever." He was right. The siege of Vienna became legend almost immediately. Priests called it divine intervention, God's hand protecting Christian Europe. Poets wrote epics comparing the defenders to ancient Spartans. Common soldiers told stories to their grandchildren about the autumn they saved the world. But beyond the celebrations, the implications were profound. The Ottoman Empire had reached its maximum extent. Suleiman would campaign again, would win battles and expand in other directions, but he would never again threaten the heart of Europe. The psychological impact was immense, The invincible Ottomans had been stopped by a medieval city with outdated walls and desperate defenders. European morale soared. Ottoman enemies sensed weakness for the first time in decades. For Vienna itself, survival came at terrible cost. Perhaps a third of the city's population had died, from bombardment, disease, starvation, combat. The walls were shattered ruins that would take years to rebuild. Entire neighborhoods were destroyed. Mass graves held thousands of defenders and civilians who had given everything to hold the line. Count von Salm, whose leadership had been essential to victory, would die months later from his wounds, his body finally succumbing to injuries his will had ignored during the siege. The fields surrounding Vienna were nightmarish after the Ottomans departed. Abandoned siege works, broken wagons, thousands of unburied corpses from both sides. Autumn rain had turned everything into a swamp of mud and death. It would take months to clear the battlefield, to bury the dead, to restore any semblance of normalcy. The psychological scars would last longer. Survivors would wake screaming from nightmares of cannon fire and janissary assaults for the rest of their lives. But they had survived. Against impossible odds, outnumbered 5-1, facing the most powerful military machine on Earth, a medieval city with determination and stone walls had said no to empire and made it stick. The balance of power in Europe had shifted. The Ottomans remained formidable. Their empire would endure for nearly 4 more centuries, but the aura of invincibility was broken. Future conflicts between East and West would be fought on more equal terms. Vienna became a symbol, not just of military defense, but of what unity and determination could achieve against overwhelming force. When people across Europe faced their own impossible situations in the centuries that followed, they remembered the autumn of 1529 when a city refused to die. The legacy echoes still. Vienna rebuilt, stronger than before. The city that survived would go on to become one of Europe's great capitals, a center of art, music, culture, science. But it never forgot the weeks when its existence hung by a thread, when every citizen became a soldier. When stone walls and human courage were all that stood between Christian Europe and Islamic conquest. Suleiman returned to Istanbul still powerful, still feared, but diminished. He had proven that even the mightiest empire has limits, that pride and power aren't always enough against desperation and determination. The siege haunted him. Chroniclers say he never spoke of Vienna without bitterness. The city that refused to fall became his one great failure in a career of conquest. And so the story of Vienna's siege enters history's great catalog of impossible stands. Like Thermopylae, like Masada, like Alamo. Moments when the few faced the many and refused to yield. Moments that echo across centuries, reminding us that sometimes the greatest victories come not from conquering, but from surviving. Now you know the story of the siege that saved Europe, the impossible defense that changed the balance between East and West forever. If tales like this ignite your imagination, if you want to explore more moments when courage defied mathematics and determination defeated destiny, then subscribe to Flow of History right now. We dive deep into the battles that shaped our world, from medieval sieges to ancient conflicts, uncovering the human stories behind history's greatest turning points. These aren't just dates and names, these are desperate struggles that determined which civilizations survived and which vanished into dust. Join our community of history enthusiasts who understand that the past isn't dead. It's the foundation everything we know was built upon. Hit that subscribe button for Flow of History, because more incredible stories of survival against impossible odds await, and you won't want to miss what's coming next.